21 seconds, that's all it took for Jasmine Crockett to freeze a nation on live TV. While Trump sneered in arrogance, a blood-red map exploded across the chamber. Cracking, packing, dilution. 95% of Texas's growth came from people of color, yet every one of the 4 new seats was stolen away. Jasmine's voice thundered. If you trust their votes, why do you silence their voices? Then she turned, eyes locked on Trump. You're not protecting democracy, you're strangling it, because deep down you know it's the only fight you can win. The chamber erupted in chaos, Trump's smirk shattered, and millions watching New Texas was only the opening move. Tonight, the mask is ripped off and what comes next will shake America to its core. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The red on-air sign blazed above the Capitol hearing room, a warning light pulsing like a heartbeat that could be felt through the marble walls. The chamber was packed to the edge as reporters elbowed for camera angles, flashes crackled like lightning, and every network from CNN to Fox locked its lens on a single stage. Outside, a line of protesters pressed against barricades, their chants muffled but steady. Let US vote. Let US vote. Inside, silence fell as the countdown began. 21 seconds, that was all it would take to freeze America. Jack Fink, his voice sharpened for live television, leaned into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this nationally televised hearing on the controversial Texas redistricting maps. He spoke with measured neutrality, but his eyes darted nervously between the figures seated at the long mahogany table. On one end sat Donald Trump, chin high, lips curled in a smug grin as though he'd already won the argument before it began. Beside him, Governor Greg Abbott lurked like a shadow, shuffling papers that looked more like weapons than notes. On the other side sat Representative Jasmine Crockett. Her hands were folded calmly, but her eyes burned with the kind of quiet fire that made allies exhale in relief and opponents shift uncomfortably in their seats. The audience was no less dramatic, and the stage itself. Rows of Latino mothers clutched photos of their children who, they feared, might grow up in a Texas where their voices no longer counted. Black veterans sat ramrod straight, their medals glinting under the fluorescent lights, men who had fought for democracy abroad only to see it stripped from their communities at home. College students hunched forward with smartphones posed, ready to live stream every tremor of truth or lie, and scattered among them were staffers, interns, lobbyists' faces tight with anticipation, as though they all knew the weight of history pressed down on the next half hour. Trump leaned back in his chair, whispering something to Abbott, his smirk widening. Cameras zoomed in on the smirk, anchors waited to spin it as confidence, but Jasmine did not move. She inhaled slowly, scanning the chamber as though memorizing every face, every light, every lens. She knew this was more than Texas, this was the battleground of America itself, painted not in blood but in lines and districts. And tonight, she intended to show the country exactly what those lines meant. Fink cleared his throat. We are live. The words hung in the air like a judge's gavel. Jasmine's fingers tightened around the folder in front of her, its edges worn from nights of preparation. Somewhere in the back row, a protester's muffled voice broke through. They're stealing our vote. Security moved, tension spiked, and Trump chuckled under his breath. Jasmine lifted her head, calm, unshaken. Her eyes flicked toward Trump, then back to the cameras. A countdown clock flashed silently on the screen for viewers at home. 21, 20, 19. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a trial, a reckoning, a clash of power and principle played out in real time. And as the final seconds ticked away, the question that gripped every American watching wasn't whether Jasmine would speak, it was this. What could she reveal in 21 seconds that might shatter the illusion of power Trump thought he owned? The countdown struck 0, and Jasmine Crockett moved. Chairs scraped as she stood, her frame straight as steel, her hand gripping the edge of an oversized map that had been hidden beneath her folder. In one swift motion, she slammed it down onto the table. The crack echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Reporters jolted forward, cameras tightened their zoom, and every eye locked on the scarlet lines carved across the paper. 3 words glared back in bold black ink. Cracking, packing, dilution. Gasps rippled through the room. The map looked grotesque, twisted into jagged shapes that cut through neighborhoods like scars across skin. Jasmine's finger traced one district where a Latino community had been split into 3 thin slivers, each absorbed by majority white strongholds. She slid her hand across another where black voters had been compressed so tightly into a single district that their ballots, though countless, would never shift power. Each line screamed strategy, not representation surgery designed to kill a voice while pretending to preserve it. Trump leaned back in his chair, lips curling into that familiar smirk. "Democracy's working just fine," he drawled, his voice oozing condescension. The words dripped into the silence like acid, meant to corrode Jasmine's authority. But instead of wavering, she locked her eyes on him, her voice slicing through the chamber like a blade. "This isn't democracy, this is white supremacy drawn in red ink." The air thickened instantly. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Reporters' pens stalled mid-sentence. A young student in the gallery covered her mouth. Somewhere in the back row, a veteran muttered, "Damn right," under his breath. Abbott stiffened beside Trump, but Trump's grin faltered for the first time. Jasmine stepped forward, her hands still pressed against the map, her voice gaining weight. She pointed to the shaded zones, naming cities, neighborhoods, families, each place more personal than the last. "This block, that's where Maria lives. She works 3 jobs and still walks her son to school before dawn. Her vote has been carved into 3 useless fragments. This neighborhood here. That's where Sergeant Davis lives, decorated in Iraq, betrayed in Texas, and here Pleasant Grove, where I grew up. They've erased half its power as though it never existed." The audience murmured louder, a current of disbelief and anger sparking through the gallery. One mother clutched her child's photopider. A veteran tapped his cane against the floor in defiance. The map was no longer abstract, it was flesh, bone, and stolen dignity. A bead of sweat slid down Trump's temple, caught in the merciless glare of the camera. He shifted in his seat, reaching for a glass of water he didn't touch. The smirk he had worn so proudly cracked under the heat of the moment. Jasmine's voice dropped to a near whisper, intimate yet thunderous through the microphones. "They want you to believe this is politics. It's not. It's an execution, one line at a time, of your right to exist as equal citizens." She paused, letting the silence ache, her eyes sweeping across the chamber before landing squarely on Trump. "And the man grinning at this table knows it." The gallery erupted, shouts, gasps, the clatter of cameras. Chaos surged, but Jasmine stood anchor, her hands steady on the map like a general planting a flag in enemy soil. The networks cut between Trump's stiffened jaw, Abbott's tightening grip on his papers, and Jasmine's own flinching stare. And as millions of Americans leaned closer to their screens, the question burned sharper than ever. If democracy can be mutilated so easily in Texas, what part of America is safe from the knife? The chamber had barely recovered from Jasmine's searing words when Greg Abbott leaned toward his microphone, his voice polished but brittle. "This is just procedure," he insisted, trying to cloak the map in bureaucratic language. "Every 10 years, states redraw lines. Nothing unusual, nothing illegal." His tone was steady, but his eyes flicked nervously toward Trump, searching for approval. Abbott wanted to sound like a man in control, yet every syllable betrayed the tremor of someone reciting a script. Jasmine didn't flinch. She tapped the map with a fingertip, sharp and deliberate. "Procedure," she repeated, her voice low, almost dangerous. Then she raised her head, locking eyes with the cameras and the millions watching. 95% of Texas's population growth over the last decade came from people of color. 95%, she let the number hang, heavy as a gavel. And yet, these maps, your maps, created not 1, not 2, not 3, but for new seats for Anglos, while stripping Black and Latino communities of their rightful voice. A hush fell, followed by murmurs that rippled like waves through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Students leaned forward, their phones vibrating with live comments from viewers across the country. A Latina mother in the second row whispered, "Cuatro sillas robadas," her voice trembling. A black veteran clenched his jaw so hard his knuckles whitened around his cane. Trump suddenly snapped, his voice booming and sharp, cutting across the murmurs like a whip. "Stop whining," his hand slammed against the table, rattling water glasses. "You lost, get over it, that's democracy." The arrogance in his tone sent a jolt through the chamber, half outrage, half disbelief. Cameras zoomed in, catching the anger twisting his face, the disdain dripping from every word. Jasmine turned toward him slowly, her eyes burning with a calm fury. "I'm not whining," she said, her voice rising, steady and resonant. I'm warning America." The words landed like thunder, a declaration that didn't just fill the chamber, it broke through screens into living rooms across the country. She pointed again to the red lines carved across Texas. If this is democracy, why do the numbers betray it? Why does nearly all the growth come from black and brown Texans, but all the power shifts away from them? Why is justice shrinking while privilege expands? Her voice cracked the air, each question a hammer blow. Abbott tried to interject, "Representative, with respect," but Jasmine cut him off, her tone slicing sharper. "Don't talk to me about respect when you've disrespected every voter whose voice you've buried under ink." The audience gasped. The air thickened with the electric tension of confrontation. Trump's lips tightened, Abbott's face paled, and the entire hearing seemed to tilt toward chaos. Reporters exchanged frantic looks, live feeds exploded with hashtags. The country was no longer just watching a hearing, it was witnessing a war of truth against power. And as Jasmine's voice echoed into the silence that followed, her eyes fixed on Trump with unrelenting fire, the question thundered louder than the gavel could strike. If they can silence Texas tonight, what will stop them from silencing America tomorrow? The chamber's air still vibrated from the clash when Jasmine shifted gears, her voice now lower, steadier, carrying the weight of decades. She reached beneath the map and pulled out a stack of yellowed court documents, their edges frayed like relics of war. "This isn't the first time Texas has stood accused," she said, each word deliberate. "And it won't be the last unless we face what's staring us in the mirror." She lifted one file, holding it high so the cameras could catch the seal of the federal court. Rulings after 1970, again in the 80s, again in 2006, time after time, federal judges declared these maps intentionally discriminatory. Not accidental, not oversight, intentional. A shiver passed through the audience. Reporters glanced at each other, aware of the history and spooling live on national television. Jasmine's hand moved across the stack, each paper a silent testimony. "Every decade," she continued, her tone cutting deeper, "they redraw lines, not for fairness, for fear. Fear of losing power, fear of your voice." From the gallery, an elderly black woman stood with trembling hands, her voice cracked but carried. "I remember," she said, her accent thick with memory, "we paid poll taxes to vote. My father worked double shifts just to have enough for one ballot. Then they redder the district and made our votes disappear. Do you know what it's like to walk home from the courthouse, knowing you've paid for a voice they'll never hear?" Gasps scattered through the room. Cameras caught Jasmine bowing her head respectfully, then raising it with renewed fire. Another elder, a Latino veteran with a chest full of ribbons, rose slowly from his seat. His words rang out like a drumbeat. "I fought for freedom overseas, and I came back to find my family shackled by maps. My brothers and sisters divided, their neighborhood sliced apart like meat on a butcher's block. We bled for democracy and democracy bled us dry. His cane struck the floor once, twice, echoing in defiance." Jasmine pointed back to the map, her voice now fierce. "They say this is just lines, but every line here is a weapon. A line can erase a neighborhood, a line can strip a community of its power. A line can silence an entire people without ever raising a gun." She stepped closer to the microphone, her face framed by the blaze of TV lights. "This is not new. It is the same war, fought with a sharper pen." Trump shifted uneasily, muttering under his breath, but Jasmine's eyes locked on him and then swept to the audience. "You think history is past? It's not. History, standing right here in this room, demanding to know if we'll repeat it again." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the furious scratching of reporters' ends and the rhythmic chant of protesters faintly heard outside. And then Jasmine leaned in, her final words laced with fire. "If every decade they redraw the lines to bury our voices, then the real question for America is this: how many times will we let them rewrite us out of history before we finally refuse to be erased?" The weight of history lingered in the chamber, and Representative Henry Cuellar rose, his voice heavy with both anger and exhaustion. He gestured to the same crimson map Jasmine had exposed. "This is my district," he said, his finger tracing 3 jagged slivers across South Texas, once whole, once united, but now sliced into pieces, carved apart like it was meat on a cutting board. Families who've lived side by side for generations are now told they belong to different districts, different voices, different futures. His tone cracked, the frustration unmistakable. How can a neighborhood that prays together, works together, and votes together suddenly be told it doesn't count as one? The audience murmured. Cameras zoomed in on the twisted, unnatural lines. They bent and curved with surgical precision, looping through Latino-heavy areas to dilute their power. Kuehler slammed his palm against the map, the sharp sound ringing like a gavel. This is not democracy. This is sabotage in broad daylight. Julie Johnson stepped forward next, her eyes glistening as she spoke. I want you to picture this, she said, her hand outstretched as if sketching the scene in the air. Two neighbors, they share a fence, they share Sunday dinners, they even send their kids to the same school. But now, one is told she belongs in District A, and the other in District B. Two houses, one block apart yet two different worlds of representation. One gets a voice, the other is silenced. That's what these maps have done. They didn't just split districts, they split communities, split families, split trust in democracy itself. Gasps echo in the gallery. Journalists scribbled furiously. A Latino mother clutched her child's backpack tighter, as if shielding him from an invisible hand pulling him away. A veteran shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "This is engineered theft." Then came the moment that silenced even the clicking of cameras. An elderly black grandmother stood, her frail hand wrapped around the small fingers of her grandson. She looked straight at the panel, her voice quivering but unyielding. "Tell me why my vote counts less," she demanded, her words cutting through the air sharper than any statistic. She raised their joined hands, trembling yet defiant. "I marched in Selma when I was younger than him. I was beaten for daring to believe my voice mattered. Now I look at him and wonder, will he grow up fighting the same battle I thought I already won?" Her grandson's wide eyes searched the room, reflecting both confusion and fear. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Trump's smirk faltered under the weight of her question. Abbott shifted uneasily, his hands gripping his papers like they might shield him from the truth. Jasmine placed her hand over her heart, then slowly extended it toward the grandmother in solemn respect. The gallery erupted not with chaos this time, but with raw, human pain. Some wept openly, others clenched fists in rage. Reporters caught it all, knowing the nation would replay this moment over and over. And as the grandmother's words lingered in the air, Jasmine leaned toward her microphone, her voice low but trembling with fire. If a grandmother who bled for the right to vote still has to beg for her ballot to count, then what does that say about the America we claim to be? The chamber had grown still after the grandmother's piercing words, a silence thick enough to choke on. And then, like a blade cutting through velvet, Trump's voice erupted. He leaned forward, his palm slamming the table with a crack that made even Abbott flinch. "Minorities are choosing us," he snarled, his face twisted with triumph. "That's why you're panicking, Jasmine. That's why you're putting on this circus. You know they don't believe in you anymore, they believe in me." His words slithered across the room, a toxic mix of arrogance and accusation, amplified by cameras eager to catch every drop of venom. The audience gasped, some in disbelief, others in rage. A Latino student in the gallery shouted back, "Then why split our neighborhoods?" Security moved to quiet him, but the echo of his challenge lingered in the air. Trump smirked, basking in the chaos, as if he thrived on the very division he denied. Jasmine did not raise her voice. Instead, she rose slowly from her seat, the map still splayed in front of her like battlefield terrain. She fixed her eyes on Trump, her voice calm yet slicing with surgical precision. "If you believe that," she said, her words echoing through the microphones, "why carve their voices out? Why erase their power? Why redraw them into silence?" She leaned closer, her gaze locked on his, unblinking. A confident man doesn't gag the crowd. A confident man doesn't fear the sound of his own people speaking. Trump tried to laugh, a hollow, brittle sound, but the cameras betrayed him. His jaw tightened, a bead of sweat glistened on his forehead. Abbott scribbled something on his notepad, but his hand shook as he did. The illusion of control was cracking, live, in front of millions. Jasmine pressed harder, her words rising with the weight of every silenced voice. "You say minorities are choosing you. Then why are you afraid to let them vote freely, to let their communities stand intact? Why do you need maps twisted like broken glass to hold your power? If their faith in you is real, why must you rig the game?" Her tone sharpened, no longer a question, but an indictment. "Because deep down, You know the truth. They are not choosing you. They are being chosen against. The audience roared, some in applause, others in outrage, the sound colliding into a storm that shook the chamber. The veteran from earlier slammed his cane on the floor again, chanting, "Let US vote. Let US vote." The chant spread, rising like thunder rolling in from every corner of the gallery. Trump's face hardened, his smirk gone, replaced with a scowl that betrayed unease. He opened his mouth to retort, but Jasmine raised her hand, silencing the room with sheer presence. Her voice cut through the nose, calm but devastatingly sharp. "This moment is not about your ego. It's about America's soul." She paused, letting the words burn into every heart watching. And then she delivered the dagger, her voice low, resolute, impossible to ignore. "So I ask, who gets to choose their leaders? The people, or the mapmakers who fear them?" The chamber was still vibrating with chants when a sudden movement caught the cameras. From the second row, a young law intern in a rumpled suit rose nervously, clutching a thick manila folder against his chest as if it were radioactive. He walked stiffly toward Jasmine, every step echoing in the tension-soaked room. Security eyed him warily, but Jasmine extended her hand with calm authority. He placed the folder in her grip, his lips whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "They told me to bury this." Jasmine slid the folder onto the table, her fingers tracing over the stamped words on its cover. "Guidance from DC." The label was bold, unmistakable, and worse, it was heavily redacted. Entire lines were blacked out, thick bars concealing truths someone had wanted buried forever. Jasmine's jaw tightened. She raised it high into the glare of the cameras, her voice resonant and cutting. "Ladies and gentlemen, let the record show these maps weren't drawn in Texas, they were ordered from above." The reaction was instant. Gasps tore through the gallery. Reporters surged forward, lenses zooming, pen scratching. A Latino mother covered her mouth in shock, while the black veteran narrowed his eyes, muttering, "I knew it." The chants outside grew louder, as if the crowd had somehow sensed what had just been revealed. Even Abbott stiffened, his hands frozen over his notes, his lips pressed into a thin line. Trump leaned forward, trying to smirk, but his voice cracked just enough to betray unease. "More theatrics," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Redacted documents, please." That could mean anything, but the sweat forming at his hairline betrayed his words. Jasmine flipped open the first page, holding it so the cameras caught the black bars covering sentences. "They tried to erase the fingerprints," she said, her tone icy, "but the smudge is still there." Whole paragraphs blacked out, lines of instructions were not allowed to read. "And tell me, if these maps were crafted in Texas, why do these documents bear the signature blocks of Washington operatives?" She slapped the page onto the table, the crack of paper onward slicing through the chamber. Reporters shouted questions over one another, trying to capture every detail. Abbott leaned toward Trump, whispering furiously, his face paling as Jasmine turned another page. "This section," she pointed, "says, ensure compliance with strategic objectives." What strategic objectives? Whose objectives, and why must the voices of Texans be redacted along with the truth? The audience erupted, torn between outrage and disbelief. One student shouted, "Read it all, don't stop." While another cried, "They're hiding it from us." The grandmother in the gallery clutched her grandson closer, her voice breaking. "This is the same shadow hand that stole from me 50 years ago." Jasmine stood taller, folder still in hand, her voice steady but electric with fury. "This isn't just about Texas anymore. This is a chain of command reaching beyond this state, reaching into the heart of Washington. This isn't democracy, it's orchestration. It's manipulation written in black ink and hidden from the people." She paused, her eyes burning into the cameras, her words carrying like a verdict. And then she delivered the blow that froze the chamber in place. "If the maps of Texas are scripted in secret by Washington's hand, then tell me who is really ruling America tonight, the voters or the puppeteers pulling their strings?" The chamber exploded the instant Jasmine's words about Washington's fingerprints hit the airwaves. Trump shot out of his chair, his face crimson, fist pounding the table so hard the microphone screeched with feedback. "Fake," he roared, the word ricocheting off marble walls. "She's a liar, a fraud. This is nothing but a witch hunt, and you." He stabbed a finger toward Jasmine, voice cracking into a snarl. "You're the witch." His rage bled into every syllable, spit flecking the microphone, as if volume alone could drown out the truth. But Jasmine didn't flinch, she didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her voice low at first, deliberate, the kind of quiet that demands attention. "No," she said, eyes locked on Trump's, her tone slicing sharper than any shout. "I'm not a liar. I'm your worst nightmare, a woman, and afraid to call you out in front of the nation you've tried to silence." The audience gasped, a wave of shock colliding with cheers that erupted from the gallery. A black veteran rose to his feet, shouting, "Tell him, Jasmine," while a few MAGA hats in the back booed loud enough to rattle the gallery rails. Abbott leaned into his mic, his voice cracking with forced authority. "Order! Order, this is out of control." He raised his hands, trying to project calm, but the chaos surged louder. Protesters outside pounded on the windows, their chants bleeding through the chamber walls. Reporters shouted questions over one another, their pens unable to keep pace with the unraveling spectacle. Abbott's pleas were swallowed whole by the storm. He was a governor waving a candle in a hurricane. Trump tried to speak again, but the roar of the gallery drowned him. Jasmine took advantage, her voice cutting through the bedlam with the precision of a blade. "You call me a liar because you're afraid of the truth. You smear me as a witch because you can't exorcise the ghosts of your own corruption. You want America to believe I'm dangerous. Then let them watch me stand unbroken while you tremble behind redacted lines and crooked maps." Her words ignited the chamber like gasoline meeting flame. Cameras zoomed on Trump's jaw, clenched so tight a vein bulged at his temple. He tried to sneer, but it twisted into something closer to fear. Abbott whispered furiously at his side, sweat pooling at his collar, but Trump shoved him away, his rage uncontainable. The chamber had turned against him, split between those who cheered Jasmine's defiance and those who howled in fury, the sound crashing together in a cacophony that threatened to tear the roof off. Jasmine raised her hand, palm open toward the audience, commanding silence without force, without fear. Slowly, the chamber hushed, as if the weight of her resolve pressed down on every chest. She looked at Trump, her voice steady but blazing with conviction. "You can shout, you can smear, you can try to bury the evidence under insults. But the truth is louder than you, Donald, and tonight, the whole world is hearing it." The gallery erupted again, this time, not in chaos, but in thunderous applause, a roar of approval that shook the chamber. And as Trump sat back down, scowling, fists clenched tight, America was left with a question too dangerous to ignore. If even the loudest man in the room can be silenced by the truth, what else will fall once the lies begin to crumble? The roar of the gallery had barely subsided when Jasmine raised her hand again, this time not to silence, but to command attention. Her eyes swept across the chamber, lingering on Trump's reddened face, then fixing squarely on the cameras broadcasting coast to coast. She lifted her phone, its screen already set to a timer. 19 seconds, she said calmly, her voice slicing through the noise. "That's all I need. Give me 19 seconds, and I'll show America exactly how they rigged the game." The screen behind her flickered to life, the first slide snapped into place, bold and brutal. Cracking, the map zoomed into South Texas, its Latino neighborhood slashed apart into narrow tendrils that curled like claws into majority-white districts. "This is cracking," Jasmine explained, her tone rising with each word. "They divide communities that have lived, prayed, and voted together for generations. Suddenly, their voices are too thin, too scattered to matter." The gallery gasped audibly. Reporters leaned forward, pens suspended midair. With a single swipe, the second slide appeared. Packing, district lines bulged grotesquely, stuffing black voters into one bloated, misshapen seat. "This is packing," Jasmine said, her hands striking the air like a judge's gavel. "They force us into cages of ink, making our votes pile on top of one another until they're wasted. A million voices screaming in one district, so the rest of the state never has to hear them again." The words hit like gunfire. A grandmother in the gallery whispered, "That's me. That's my street." Her grandson's small hand tightened around hers. Jasmine swiped again. The third slide lit up. Dilution, districts bent into grotesque shapes, lines looping nonsensically around suburbs, slicing through cities like open wounds. "This is dilution," Jasmine declared. "Every unnatural curve you see is not an accident, it's a weapon. Each twisted line is a scalpel designed to cut a voice out of the body of democracy." The image froze on the screen, districts so distorted they looked like monsters crawling across Texas. The timer ticked down. 5 seconds left. Trump's face hardened, his jaw tightening as the camera caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. He muttered something to Abbott, but Abbott's hands betrayed him. Papers shuffled, fingers tapping nervously against the desk, a man caught between obedience and exposure. Jasmine's voice thundered as the timer struck 0. That was 19 seconds. 19 seconds to prove that what they call procedure is really sabotage. That what they call democracy is nothing more than a noose tightening around the throats of black and brown Texans. She slammed her hand against the podium, the sound reverberating like a war drum. The chamber erupted again, cheers, boos, shouts colliding into a storm that seemed too large to be contained by walls. Reporters shouted into microphones, broadcasting live updates as the hashtag 19 seconds ignited across social media. Trump's lips pressed into a hard line, his eyes narrowing, as though he knew every second Jasmine spoke was another crack splintering his facade. And then Jasmine leaned forward, her voice dropping into a razor-edged whisper that carried louder than any shout. The truth doesn't fear a clock. The what happens when power fears exposure. The chamber, already burning with tension, grew heavier when the microphone was slid toward a woman in the gallery. A Latina mother in a faded work uniform stood slowly, clutching her son's backpack as if it were proof of her existence. Her voice trembled at first, but then steadied, carrying the raw cadence of exhaustion. "I work 2 jobs, she said, staring straight at the panel, "and I still wake my boy up at 5 in the morning to walk him to school. I pay my taxes, I stand in line to vote, and now my district tells me my voice is disposable." She lifted the backpack for the cameras, her knuckles white. "Disposable, like this is trash. Like I am trash." The words sliced the air, leaving the chamber suspended in stunned silence. Reporters scribbled furiously. One of them whispered, "She just told the whole story of Texas into sentences." Jasmine bowed her head for a beat, then looked up, her eyes fierce with shared fury. Abbott shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Trump tried to sneer, but the cameras had already moved past him. The mother's testimony was not a statistic, it was a wound, open and bleeding before the nation. The microphone passed next to a tall black veteran, his uniform jacket stretched across broad shoulders, metals clinking softly as he stood. His gaze was steady, but when he spoke, his voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. "I fought abroad for freedom," he said, his hand shaking as it tapped the ribbons on his chest, "and I lost it at home." He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes darting to the distorted map projected on the screen. "I bled in sand I couldn't even pronounce so my children could live free. And now you tell me they live in a district designed to mute their voices. That the very democracy nearly died for is nothing more than lines on paper twisted to suit a man's ambition." The gallery erupted, cheers, sobs, furious chants all colliding into one storm. The veteran's voice rose above it, sharp as a bayonet. "I didn't serve my country just to come back and watch my family's future stolen at the ballot box." Trump rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath, but the veteran slammed his cane against the floor, the crack echoing like a rifle shot. Every head turned back toward the front. Jasmine gripped the edge of her table, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with righteous fire. And as the weight of their testimonies hung in the room like smoke after battle, she delivered the question that cut deeper than any statistic ever could. If the workers who keep this country alive and the soldiers who bled for its flag are told their voices don't count, then what kind of nation are we becoming? The room shifted again when Congressman Al Green rose, his voice already vibrating with restrained thunder. His presence alone commanded the chamber. His tall frame, his silvered hair, his eyes hardened by decades of battles over justice. He pointed at the map still glowing red on the giant screen. "This is not just about neighborhoods," he said, his tone like a preacher's sermon wrapped in steel. "They carved out our lifelines. Dallas Love Field Airport gone from our district. The economic heart that fed thousands of black and brown families ripped away and handed to another. That wasn't coincidence. That was calculation." His words struck like a hammer, forcing heads to turn, pens to halt mid-scribble. "When you take away our engines of prosperity, you don't just move a line, you break a spine." A wave of murmurs ran through the crowd, swelling like a storm. Cameras caught mothers nodding, veterans glaring, students whispering fiercely into their phones. Abbott shifted in his chair again, trying to maintain composure, but his jaw twitched under the spotlight. Trump leaned back, smirking faintly, though his fingers tapped impatiently on the table, a tell that the camera is seized upon. Then Congressman Mark Veazey took the microphone, his voice clipped but searing with emotion. He gestured to another section of the map, tracing the red lines that twisted through his district like a cold snake. "They didn't just move lines," he said, his voice breaking before regaining force. "They stole futures." The words cut into the silence like glass. He lifted his hand, palm open, almost as if holding invisible weight. "Every job lost when they ripped Love Field away, every small business crushed when they stripped our tax base, every family forced to leave because opportunity was pulled out from under them, those futures were stolen." That is what this map represents. Theft on a scale that makes burglary look like child's play. The gallery erupted with shouts, some of fury, some of sorrow. A young man in the back yelled, "My mom worked at that airport for 20 years. A woman wept openly, her sobs piercing through the cacophony. Reporters leaned in, the word stolen already blazing across their notepads. Jasmine rose slightly, her voice carrying over the storm with deadly precision. "This is why they fear the truth. Because once America sees these maps for what they are, they'll understand it isn't just lines, it's livelihoods. Not just districts, it's destines." She let the silence tighten like a noose around the chamber before delivering her final blow. "And if they can steal the engines of our prosperity today, what will stop them from stealing the very soul of democracy tomorrow?" The air was still vibrating from Veazey's declaration when Trump leaned forward, lips curling into a sneer the cameras devoured instantly. His voice dripped with mockery, sharp enough to slice through the murmur of the gallery. "Cry me a river," he spat, waving a dismissive hand toward Jasmine as though she were nothing more than background noise. The words slithered across the room like poison, igniting jeers from his supporters and gasps from those who had been silent until now. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She rose with deliberate calm, the map still glowing behind her like a battlefield scar. Her eyes narrowed, her voice a blade cutting through the smog of Trump's contempt. "This isn't a river," she thundered, her hand slamming down on the podium. "It's a flood of injustice, and it's drowning your lies." The gallery erupted, cheers clashing with boos, fists raised in fury, cameras flashing like lightning bolts. Even the veteran in the front row pounded his cane to the floor in approval, each strike echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. Trump's face hardened, his smirk breaking under the weight of the words. He leaned into his mic, but his voice faltered for just a fraction of a second, a crack that millions watching at home caught in real time. "You're grandstanding," he barked, but his tone lacked the fire he'd wielded moments earlier. Abbott placed a hand on his arm, whispering frantically, but Trump jerked away, his jaw tightening, eyes burning holes into Jasmine. Jasmine stepped closer to the microphone, her voice dropping lower, the kind of quiet that forces the world to lean in. "You call it crying because you've never lived the pain of being erased. You call it whining because you've never known the terror of being silenced. But what you fear most isn't my words, it's the millions who see themselves in me, and who will no longer be gagged by men like you." Her words fell like hammers, each syllable pounding into the chamber's marble walls. The gallery thundered with divided fury, chants of "Let US vote," clashing with shouts of "LIAR." Security scrambled, but the spectacle was beyond control. Cameras zoomed in on Jasmine's face, unflinching, her eyes a blaze of steel. Trump, usually the master of the moment, sat stiff, fists clenched, a man suddenly realizing the ground beneath him was slipping. And then Jasmine delivered the dagger, her voice sharp, unrelenting, alive with fire. "If even the strong among us feels silence tonight, then how long before silence itself becomes permanent?" The chamber darkened as screens behind Jasmine flickered to life, replacing the chaos with stark black and white rulings that glowed like ghosts of battles past. Shelby County v. Holder, Allen v. Milligan, Louisiana's federal injunctions. Headlines and case numbers splashed across the walls, each one a wound carved into the history of American democracy. Jasmine's voice rang steady, clear, and cinematic, half lawyer, half warrior. "Democracy." Jasmine's voice rang steady, clear, and cinematic, half lawyer, half warrior. The Voting Rights Act was written with blood, defended in courts, and reaffirmed in decisions you hoped Americans would forget. But the record is right here, in ink you can't erase. She raised a hand, and with it, images of coalition districts, the pure districts where Latino and Black voters had once stood united to demand representation, only to be sliced apart by the stroke of a pen. The graphics pulsed red, dissecting maps like an autopsy of democracy itself. In Alabama, Jasmine continued, her voice sharp as the crack of a gavel, the Supreme Court ruled just last year that denying communities of color their fair share is not politics, it is unlawful. In Louisiana, judges declared the maps so discriminatory, it could not stand. And yet here, in Texas, you expect to pull the same con and call it procedure. Trump shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the screens, his smirk thinning as the words intentionally discriminatory blazed behind him. Abbott scribbled frantically on a notepad, as if searching for an escape hatch, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She stepped closer to the committee's microphone, her tone lowering into a deadly calm that carried more weight than shouting ever could. The law is not on your side. History is not on your side. And justice, whether through these courts or through the people watching at home, will not be on your side. The gallery leaned in, breaths caught, as the rulings continued to flash. Names of judges, dates of decisions, legal language stripped down into one undeniable truth that the pattern was deliberate, the strategy cynical, and the consequences catastrophic. The energy in the room shifted. No longer was this just political theater, it was a trial. And Trump and Abbott looked less like leaders and more like defendants caught red-handed. And then Jasmine delivered the line that split the chamber in two, her voice carrying the weight of every precedent and every broken promise. Every ruling you ignore, every safeguard you shred, is not just a violation of the law, it is a countdown to your own reckoning. Trump leaned back in his chair, lips curling into the kind of smirk designed to ignite fury. The law's on our side, he declared, voice dripping with arrogance, as if centuries of struggle and rulings could be dismissed with a shrug. His words were met with a ripple of gasps from the gallery, the kind that turns a room electric, as though everyone knew this was the moment where the mask of confidence might finally shatter. Jasmine did not flinch. She rose slowly, her hand resting on the edge of the table, steady as steel. Her eyes locked on Trump's, unblinking, unyielding. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. "You don't respect the law, you bend it. You twist it like a steel wire, forcing it into shapes it was never meant to hold until it finally snaps back. And when it does, it won't just cut you, it will cut deep enough to scar this nation if we let you get away with it." Abbott muttered objection, almost by instinct, but his words were swallowed by the thunder of audience reaction, Latino mothers rising to their feet, veterans pounding fists against their chairs, journalists scribbling like mad as if history were being carved into the page in real time. Cameras zoomed tight on Trump's jaw, twitching beneath the floodlights, his grin wobbling as Jasmine stepped closer, her voice now low and deliberate, daring him to interrupt. "You hide behind courts you've stacked, judges you pressured, and maps drawn in back rooms, but let's strip the varnish away. Laws are only as strong as the truth behind them, and you," she said, raising a finger toward him, "have built your empire on lies." The crowd hissed, cheered, murmured, chaos spilling over into a chorus of defiance. Trump slammed a fist on the table, shouting, "Liar!" That the word cracked against the chamber walls, hollow and desperate. Jasmine leaned forward, her tone unwavering, her eyes glinting like fire under glass. "If the law were truly on your side, you wouldn't need to silence voices, redraw lines, and erase futures. A confident man doesn't fear ballots, only a coward does." The chamber fell into a taut silence, broken only by the whirring of cameras and the muffled gasps of onlookers. Trump's face flushed red, Abbott's papers slipped from his trembling hands, and for a fleeting second the balance of power shifted not to those clinging to maps and technicalities, but to the millions watching who now saw the game for what it was. Jasmine's final words pierced the stillness, ringing like a verdict. "The law doesn't belong to you, Mr. Trump. It belongs to the people, and they are watching every second." Jasmine rose once more, the chamber lights casting a sharp halo around her figure. Her voice carried not just across the room, but into the bones of everyone listening. "Law isn't a cage to trap voters," she declared, her hands slicing through the air for emphasis. "It's a fence to protect them." The words rang out like a hammer against steel, uncheckable, undeniable. The audience erupted, applause thundered, stomps rattled the floor, and the sound of raw approval rolled through the Capitol like a tidal wave. Reporters stood, jostling for position, their cameras catching every glint of determination in her eyes. Even some Republican aides, usually stone-faced, shifted uneasily in their seats, as though for the first time they felt the ground tilt beneath them. Trump's face stiffened. His jaw clenched as he tried to mask the flicker of unease. Abbott tugged at his collar, sweat darkening the fabric. Yet Jasmine pressed forward, her tone steady, layered with a fire that could not be contained. "The Constitution isn't your weapon," she said, turning her gaze from Trump to the audience. "It's our shield. It wasn't written to preserve privilege, it was written to protect the powerless, to give a voice to the silenced, to guarantee that no ink, no pen, no backroom deal could erase the will of the people." A murmur swept the gallery, elders nodding through tears, young activists clutching each other's hands as if she had spoken the words they'd waited their whole lives to hear. Jasmine's voice rose, each sentence landing like a drumbeat in a war march. But what happens when the pen is hijacked? When the Constitution is twisted into a barricade for the few instead of a bridge for the many? That is not democracy. That is tyranny in red, white, and blue wrapping. Trump attempted to laugh, but the sound died in his throat, drowned by the roar of the crowd. His hand slammed the table again, desperate to reclaim dominance, but this time it echoed not with strength, but with fear. Jasmine leaned in, her eyes narrowing, her words falling with surgical precision. "Power may think it owns the pen. But the Constitution was not written for kings, it was written to prevent them." The room froze, silence cutting sharp as glass, everyone waiting for the final blow. Jasmine let the pause linger, then delivered it with quiet conviction, every syllable trembling with urgency. "So I ask you, when power tries to script the future, will the law defend the people, or will it abandon them?" The gavel cracked like a pistol shot, the chair's voice slicing through the chamber. "Representative Crockett, one more outburst and you will be held in contempt." The words weren't just a warning, they were a blade pressed against her throat, a signal that the machinery of power was ready to swallow her whole. Gasps rippled, reporters scribbling furiously, sensing the story teetering on the edge of chaos. Trump leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a cruel grin, seizing the moment like a predator scenting blood. "Throw her out," he sneered, his voice solely with arrogance, "just like her voters. They don't matter, and neither does she." The words hung heavy in the air, venom wrapped in laughter, an echo of the very disenfranchisement Jasmine had been fighting to expose. His allies chuckled darkly, the sound dripping like acid into the chamber's tense silence. But Jasmine did not flinch, she straightened, shoulders squaring as if the threat had only made her taller. Slowly, deliberately, she turned from the chair to the camera lens. Her eyes locked onto it like steel, as though she were staring not into glass, but into the very soul of the nation watching at home. The room seemed to contract around her, every heartbeat sensed to her resolve. "I will not be silenced," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "Not by contempt, not by threats, not by the arrogance of men who believe democracy belongs only to them." Her words rolled like thunder, gathering force with each syllable. "You may gloat, you may mock, but here's the truth. When you silence me, you silence millions. And America will not forgive you for it." The crowd erupted, half in wild applause, half in furious jeers. The gallery became a battlefield of sound, unity and division clashing in one violent wave. Abbott muttered frantic pleas for order, his voice drowned by the storm. Trump slammed the table, shouting, but the camera stayed fixed on Jasmine, the only image that mattered. She raised her chin higher, her expression carved with defiance. "History isn't written by those who hide behind gavels or threats," she said, her tone low, lethal. "It's written by those who dare to stand when told to sit down, by those who speak when ordered to be silent, and I will not be erased." The chamber froze, as if even time itself dared not interrupt her. Reporters stopped writing, eyes wide. Somewhere, a single clap broke through the hush, and then another, and another. Jasmine's final words cut like a blade, each one deliberate, each one undeniable. "So tell me, America, when they threaten your voice, will you bow? Or will you rise?" The chamber quaked before the gavel could fall again. A sound, low at first, rose from the gallery like a drumbeat echoing through the rafters. "Let us vote." The chant ripped through the air, jagged, raw, unstoppable. Within seconds, the words were not just shouts but a tidal wave. The audience surged to its feet, fists raised, their bodies forming a living wall of defiance against the machinery of silence. Phones glowed across the hall, capturing every second. On screens across the nation, hashtags flared like lightning. Hashtag let us vote. Hashtag our votes our power. Within minutes, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook bowled with clips of the uprising, millions of shares fusing into one digital roar. A veteran in uniform stood tall in the gallery, voice breaking as he shouted, "I bled for this flag. Don't tell me my ballot is worthless." A teacher lifted her gradebook high and cried, "You steal from my students when you redraw their future." A group of students, faces lit by cell phone screens, screamed in unison, "We are not disposable." Their words struck like hammers, pounding against every wall meant to contain them. On the floor, Abbott slammed his hand on the desk, veins bulging in his neck. "Order, sit down, this is disorderly conduct." But his voice was drowned, swallowed by the thunder rolling from the gallery. Trump barked for security, his face red, jowls trembling with fury. Yet the guards hesitated, caught in the tide of humanity that surged louder with every heartbeat. Jasmine stood motionless, her hand pressed to the folder of evidence against her chest, eyes shimmering as she absorbed the chorus erupting above her. For the first time that night, she did not need to speak. The people had taken her words and set them ablaze, carrying the fire higher than even she imagined. The cameras panned in wild arcs, feeding the chaos to every living room in America. Some viewers wept. Others shouted at their screens, joining the chant from hundreds of miles away, their voices merging with the uproar inside the chamber. The air thickened with history, as though the building itself strained to hold the weight of the moment. And then, as the chant shook the Capitol walls, Jasmine lifted her gaze to the camera, her lips forming a single sentence the nation would never forget. "This is not my fight alone. It is yours, and tonight, America has already risen." Jasmine leaned forward, her voice sharpened into a blade that cut through the cacophony. "You fear one thing above all, Donald, accountability." Her words hung heavy, daring anyone to breathe. The chamber froze as she began to strike, each accusation dropping like a hammer blow. "The Epstein files you buried in locked drawers. The $400 million plain deal rooted through shadow companies. The crypto schemes that siphon pension funds into your allies' pockets." With every revelation, gasps rippled, pens scratched, phones lit up, and the gallery swelled with rage. Trump's hands gripped the edge of his podium, knuckles whitening as he forced out a laugh that cracked at the edges. "You're insane, completely insane," he barked, spittle flying, but his eyes betrayed him darting, cornered, hunted by truths he couldn't smother. Jasmine's tone didn't waver, didn't soften. She stepped closer, her voice rising above the pandemonium, steady as a war drum. "No. I'm awake, and now America is too. You call it insanity because it terrifies you, because it's the first time in years that the people are watching with their eyes wide open, refusing to blink." The air quivered, charged, as if every syllable carried an electric current. The audience leaned forward, bodies tense, caught in the storm between predator and prey. Abbott shuffled his papers, fumbling like a man trying to hold sand in his fists. Security glanced nervously at each other, uncertain whether to intervene or simply witness. Jasmine slammed her hand down on the folder of evidence, the echo cracking across the chamber like a gunshot. "Every secret you've hidden, every line you've redrawn, every deal you've whispered in the dark, it all leads here. Tonight isn't about me versus you, it's about whether truth still matters in a country we swore to defend." The crowd erupted, cheers, boos, screams colliding into a wall of raw sound. Trump's face hardened, lips trembling in fury, but he couldn't drown her out. No insult could erase the storm she had unleashed. The camera zoomed in, catching the sweat beading on his forehead and the fire blazing in hers. And as the chamber teetered between collapse and awakening, Jasmine's words cut through like thunder. "What happens when truth becomes louder than power?" Jasmine's hand rose slowly, deliberate, cutting through the noise like a conductor demanding silence. Her finger pointed toward the gallery, where an elderly black grandmother sat trembling, her frail hands clutching a faded American flag so tightly the fabric shook. The crowd turned, following Jasmine's gaze, and the room seemed to contract into a single point of human truth. She stood in line for hours, Jasmine's voice rang out, echoing across the chamber. Her back aching, her knees burning, her hands numb in the cold because she believed in a promise written into the very bones of this nation. "And you," her eyes seared into Trump and Abbott, "you've redrawn her out of democracy." The grandmother's lips quiver as a tear traced down her cheek. Around her, Strangers reached out to steady her trembling frame. Some wept openly, others clenched fists against their mouths, unable to swallow the weight of what they were witnessing. A young boy beside her grandson, no more than 10, looked up at Jasmine with wide, searching eyes, his voice breaking the silence with a whisper that microphones still caught. Why doesn't her vote matter? The chamber erupted not with boos or cheers, but with a raw, collective gasp that felt like the air itself had been punched. Jasmine's words had transformed the abstract into the undeniable, the statistics into flesh and blood. And in that moment, it wasn't about maps or court rulings, it was about a grandmother's tear and a woe's question. Trump shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath, but every camera was trained not on him, but on the grandmother's trembling hands clutching the flag like a lifeline. Abbott looked down, his jaw tight, paper suddenly meaningless before the living evidence of injustice. Jasmine's voice lowered, softer now, almost a plea but sharpened with steel. This is not theory. This is not debate. This is America crying out from the gallery, holding on to a flag that her government keeps ripping from her grasp. The room shook with silence, heavier than any roar. And then Jasmine drove it home, her final words slicing through the chamber like lightning through a storm. If this woman no longer belongs to democracy, then tell me, who among us truly does? Trump leaned forward, his jaw set, voice sharp enough to cut the air. This is about winning. Nothing else matters. The chamber tensed, as if the very walls recoiled from the bluntness of his creed. The word hung there, heavy, a confession and a threat rolled into one. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a drumbeat of defiance. Her voice rose, not as a shout, but as something far more dangerous, controlled, clear, undeniable. No, this isn't about winning. This is about worth. Every life, every voice, worth the same on election day. Her words sliced through the silence, pulling eyes toward her like gravity. Screens across America froze on her face, her expression carved with fire and resolve. For one searing moment, even Trump seemed caught in the glare, his practiced smirk faltering, his tongue still. The audience erupted, cheers colliding with boos, chants rattling the rafters, the kind of raw noise that feels less like sound and more like the pulse of a nation split in two. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras zoomed tight, capturing the split-second hesitation in Trump's eyes, the flicker of uncertainty that betrayed the man who had built an empire on swagger. Jasmine let the pause stretch, refusing to rush, forcing the silence to burn. Then, with a voice as steady as the hand of history itself, she delivered the line that drew blood. You measure power in victories. I measure it in people, and people are not pawns on your board, they are the soul of this republic. Trump opened his mouth, but nothing came. The pause was deafening, and for the first time that night, the master of spectacle stood stripped of words. The chamber, the cameras, the country, everyone saw it. Jasmine stepped back, letting the silence convict him. Her eyes swept the room, then locked back on the nation watching. Her final words fell like a gavel. If democracy belongs only to the winners, then America has already lost. But if it belongs to the people, then tonight, we just took it back. Jasmine stood tall at the center of the storm, the weight of the chamber pressing in around her, the echo of divided shouts still vibrating against the marble walls. Slowly, deliberately, she turned toward the camera lens as though she were looking directly into the living rooms of millions of Americans. The lights dimmed, shadows stretching long, and a single spotlight fixed on her face, sharpening every word into steel. Her voice carried no tremor, only fire. Democracy doesn't survive on autopilot, it survives when we fight for it. Texas is just the start. Tomorrow, it could be you. Her eyes narrowed, the intensity of her stare daring the audience to turn away. Stand up, speak out, vote. For a breathless instant, the chamber went silent, even the hecklers stunned into stillness. Music began to rise beneath her words, low and foreboding at first, then building into a swell that seemed to shake the air itself. The American flag on the wall behind her rippled under the draft of the overhead fans, catching the light like a warning flare. Reporters leaned forward, tense suspended, as though they knew this was the line that would outlive the night. Jasmine lifted the folder of evidence one last time, its edges glowing under the spotlight, then let it drop with a decisive thud onto the desk before her. The sound echoed like a gavel, final and uncompromising. This fight isn't mine alone, she continued, her tone cutting deeper now, raw with urgency. It belongs to every worker who's been ignored, every veteran left behind, every grandmother pushed out of her own district. If they can erase us here, they can erase you anywhere. A tear slipped down the cheek of the grandmother in the gallery, clutching her flag tighter, while students and veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by the glow of phones capturing the moment. On social feeds, #Surge, #StandWithJasmine, #DefendDemocracy trending in real time. As the country's heartbeat accelerated. The music hit its peak. Jasmine's eyes locked on the camera one final time, her voice ablaze against the dark. If democracy silenced here, then tell me, where will it ever speak again? The lights cut to black, silence, and then the nation erupted. True democracy isn't something we inherit, it's something we protect, day after day, with courage and with voice. Jasmine's stand reminds us that silence, in the face of injustice, is never neutral, it is surrender. Each of us carries the same power she demanded in that chamber, the power to speak, to resist, to choose a future worthy of our children. But power unused is power lost. So ask yourself, when the moment comes to defend what is right, will you remain silent or will you rise and be heard? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.